While JD Vance was landing in Islamabad and the Western press was counting missiles, something extraordinary was happening inside Iran that almost no English-language outlet covered at all. The Iranian rial, the country's national currency, lost 34% of its value in 6 weeks. Not 34% since sanctions began, not 34% since the nuclear deal collapsed, 34% in 6 weeks of active war. And here is what that number actually means for a family in Tehran buying bread this morning. The price of a kilogram of chicken in Iran went from the equivalent of $1.40 before the war to $3.80 last week. For a country where the average monthly salary sits around $200, that is not an inconvenience. That is a survival calculation being made at kitchen tables across a country of 90 million people. This is the story that every major outlet missed, and it changes everything you think you understand about who is winning and who is losing in Islamabad. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that contradicts almost everything you have heard from official sources on both sides. When the United States and Israel launched strikes on February 28th, Iran's economy was already under severe strain from decades of sanctions, but it was functioning. The rial was trading at approximately 580,000 to the dollar on the open market. Inflation was running at around 40% annually, painful but priced in. Iranians had developed what economists who track the country describe as one of the most sophisticated informal economies in the world, built specifically to survive American economic pressure. Then the bombs fell, and the Strait of Hormuz closed. According to financial tracking data cited by Bloomberg this week, data that has received almost no pickup in major English-language outlets, the rial collapsed to 830,000 to the dollar within 3 weeks of the conflict beginning. By the end of the 6th week, it had touched 950,000. A currency that had already been beaten down by decades of sanctions lost nearly another half of its remaining value in a month and a half. Here is why that number matters beyond the obvious headline. Iran's government, like every government, pays its soldiers, its bureaucrats, its state employees, and its social welfare recipients in rials. When the rial loses 40% of its value in 6 weeks, the real purchasing power of every government salary, every pension, every subsidy payment collapses proportionally. The regime does not just face a foreign policy problem in Islamabad, it faces a payroll problem that touches every person whose loyalty it depends on to function. There is a second number that Bloomberg's data captures that is even more alarming. Iran imports approximately 30% of its essential medicines: insulin, cancer treatments, dialysis supplies, blood pressure medications. These are purchased in hard currency, dollars, euros on international markets. When the rial falls 40%, the cost of importing those medicines in rial terms rises 40% immediately, and the government's ability to subsidize the gap, already strained before the war, has been further compressed by the military spending the conflict demands. Doctors in Tehran, speaking to international journalists who got access through Turkish and Iraqi intermediaries, have described running out of specific cancer medications entirely, not running low, running out. And waiting lists for dialysis in some provincial hospitals have reportedly tripled since the war began. This is the humanitarian dimension of this conflict that the Western press, focused entirely on oil prices and diplomatic maneuvering, has almost completely ignored.
Now, before you reach the conclusion that economic pain automatically translates into regime collapse, which is exactly what the Trump administration assumed going into this war and exactly why their predictions failed, you need to understand something fundamental about how Iran's economy actually functions. Iran has spent 45 years building what analysts at Chatham House have called the world's most sophisticated sanctions evasion architecture. And that architecture did not collapse when the bombs fell. It adapted. Here's how it works in practice. Iran's formal banking system has been cut off from SWIFT, the international financial messaging system, since 2018, so Iran does not use SWIFT. Iranian banks operate through a network of correspondent banks in Iraq, Turkey, Oman, and several other intermediary jurisdictions that maintain dual relationships, formal ties with the Western financial system and informal ties with Tehran. When an Iranian company needs to pay for something internationally, the payment does not flow through Iran at all. It flows from a Turkish or Iraqi entity settled in local currency or through commodity exchange, with the underlying credit ultimately tracing back to Iran through a chain of transactions that is deliberately designed to be untraceable. The system is not perfect. It is expensive. The intermediary markup can add 15 to 20% to transaction costs, but it works. And crucially, it has continued to work throughout this conflict. The same architecture applies to oil. Iran's oil exports did not stop when sanctions were imposed in 2018. They rerouted. According to data compiled by Klepper, the shipping analytics firm, Iran was exporting approximately 1.5 million barrels of oil per day in the months before this war, almost entirely through what the industry calls dark fleet operations. Tankers with falsified registration, transponders turned off, ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, with the oil ultimately arriving in Chinese refineries priced at a significant discount to Brent. Those dark fleet operations have been disrupted by the war, but not eliminated. Iran's oil revenue fell, but did not go to zero. And here is the geopolitical irony that nobody wants to say clearly. Every barrel of Iranian oil that reached China through shadow channels during this conflict helped keep China's energy costs slightly lower, which means China had very specific economic incentives to ensure that Iran's shadow export infrastructure survived, not because of ideology, but because it was saving Beijing money every single day the war continued. This is the section that mainstream Western media finds almost impossible to report honestly, because the truthful answer does not fit neatly into either the pro-war narrative or the anti-regime narrative that dominate English-language coverage. What do ordinary Iranians actually think about this war? The honest answer, based on reporting from journalists with access inside the country, primarily through European outlets, Al Jazeera, and Iranian diaspora media, is it is complicated. And that complexity is politically important. There is a segment of the Iranian population, concentrated among younger, urban, educated Iranians, that opposed the Islamic Republic before this war began. These are the same people who came out in enormous numbers in 2022 during the Masa Amini protests, the Green Movement generation, the people who have been waiting for the regime to fracture. What happened to that population when the bombs fell? According to multiple accounts from inside Iran, carefully reported by outlets with correspondents who maintained access, something unexpected happened. A significant portion of that same population, people who had marched against the regime, shifted their position, not to supporting the government, not to loving the supreme leader, but to opposing the American strikes. The logic expressed repeatedly in social media posts that Iranian diaspora media translated and republished ran something like this. We want change in Iran. We want it on our terms. And American bombs do not bring change on our terms. They bring rubble and economic collapse that falls on us first. This is a documented phenomenon in the academic literature on sanctions and military intervention. Researchers who study authoritarian regimes have consistently found that external military pressure tends to consolidate national identity around regime survival, even among populations that actively oppose that regime, because the alternative being presented by the attacking power appears worse than the status quo. Iran's government understands this dynamic extremely well. It is one of the reasons why the regime's messaging throughout this conflict has been almost entirely focused on national survival and Iranian sovereignty rather than ideological arguments about the Islamic Revolution. They were not trying to win the argument among people who already opposed them. They were trying to neutralize those people's opposition by framing the conflict as an attack on Iran itself rather than an attack on the regime. By most accounts, that strategy worked.
The streets of Tehran did not rise. The protests that Bolton and others predicted would materialize in the wake of the supreme leader's assassination did not happen at the scale and intensity that the war's architects expected. That does not mean the regime is popular. It means that external military pressure made internal opposition temporarily less politically viable, a distinction that Washington's war planners either did not understand or chose to ignore. Now, here is where the internal economic picture connects directly to what is happening in Islamabad right now, in a way that almost no analysis has made explicit. Iran went into this war with foreign currency reserves that analysts estimated at between $20 and $30 billion in accessible funds, not the frozen assets in Qatar and Japan and Iraq, accessible reserves. 6 weeks of war, 6 weeks of a military consuming ammunition, fuel, and replacement equipment, 6 weeks of a rial in freefall requiring central bank intervention to prevent complete collapse. That reserve position has been significantly depleted. Multiple economists who track Iran's fiscal position have estimated to international financial media that Iran's accessible reserves are now somewhere between $12 and $18 billion. That sounds like a lot, but consider the burn rate. Iran's import bill in normal times runs approximately $60 billion per year. With the rial collapsed and alternative supply chains more expensive, the effective import bill has risen, while the ability to pay it has compressed. By some estimates, Iran is burning through reserves at a rate that gives it somewhere between 8 and 14 months before a genuine external payments crisis. That timeline is directly relevant to the Islamabad talks. When Iran demanded the unfreezing of those assets sitting in Qatar, Japan, India, and Iraq as a precondition for any serious discussion, the demand that Reuters' source claimed had already been met before talks began and that American officials flatly denied, it was not just a political demand, it was a financial lifeline request. The tens of billions sitting frozen in those jurisdictions, if released, would roughly double Iran's accessible reserve position overnight. It would buy the regime the economic breathing room to stabilize the rial, restart medicine imports, begin rebuilding, and face the post-war period from a position of survival rather than slow-motion fiscal collapse. Iran needs that money. It needs it badly. And the fact that it has sent negotiators to Islamabad, a regime that believes it won this conflict militarily, tells you something important. The war that Iran won on the battlefield is creating a financial pressure that the battlefield victory cannot relieve. And that, rather than any military consideration, may be the actual leverage point that makes a deal possible. Not American military pressure, not the threat of resumed bombing, but the quiet, undercovered reality that behind the defiant public statements, Iran's finance ministry is watching the reserve numbers and the rial chart and calculating exactly how many more weeks of this the country can absorb before the economic pain becomes politically unmanageable. There is one final dimension to this story that Western coverage has almost entirely missed, because it requires understanding Iranian history rather than just tracking Iranian missiles. When Ayatollah Khomeini established the Islamic Republic in 1979, the revolution made a specific economic promise to the Iranian poor. Khomeini's movement drew enormous support from the urban working class and the rural poor by promising that an Islamic government would redistribute wealth, end dependence on foreign powers, and deliver economic dignity to people who had been left behind by the Shah's modernization project. That promise, which the Islamic Republic has never fully delivered on but has always invoked as its legitimacy foundation, is now under severe strain in a way that goes beyond any previous rounds of sanctions created. The families in Tehran struggling with doubled food prices, the cancer patients waiting for medications that aren't coming, the young engineers whose savings evaporated when the rial collapsed. These are not people who are angry at America. They are angry at a government that told them it would protect them and is now asking them to absorb yet more economic suffering in the name of a victory they cannot eat. The Islamic Republic has survived previous economic crises by pointing at American sanctions and saying, the enemy is out there. The hardship you feel is caused by Washington, not by us. That argument is harder to make when the government simultaneously claims to have won the war. If you won, Iranians are asking quietly, why is chicken 4 times the price of what it was last month? That contradiction between the victory narrative the regime needs for domestic legitimacy and the economic reality its citizens are living through is the fracture that Bolton was pointing at when he talked about internal pressure. He just couldn't describe it clearly because American intelligence does not read the Persian language social media accounts where Iranians are actually having this conversation. The regime is not about to collapse. Let's be clear about that. It has institutional depth, security apparatus control, and a nationalistic narrative it can lean on. But it is governing a population that is exhausted, economically damaged, and increasingly willing to ask uncomfortable questions, quietly, carefully, in ways that do not cross the lines that get people arrested, but persistently. That is the real pressure that the Islamabad negotiations need to address, not the pressure America applied with bombs, the pressure Iran's own population is creating through the unavoidable arithmetic of a collapsing currency and an empty medicine shelf.
Here is the honest picture that nobody in official Washington and nobody in official Tehran wants to say out loud. The war achieved what wars almost always achieve. It destroyed things, it killed people, it disrupted economies, and it created a political reality that nobody who planned it intended or predicted. Iran's government survived, but the Iranian people are paying a price that the regime's victory rhetoric cannot paper over indefinitely. America's military demonstrated overwhelming firepower, but the bombs did not produce the political outcome that justified them. Saudi Arabia discovered that the American security umbrella has holes exactly where the rain falls hardest. And 90 million Iranians are waking up every morning to a currency that is worth half what it was 2 months ago, and medicine shelves that grow emptier by the week. That is the story that the Islamabad talks are actually about. Not the nuclear program, that's a bargaining chip. Not the missiles, those are leverage. Not even the Strait of Hormuz, that is a negotiating position. The real story is a 90 million person country whose government needs a financial lifeline and whose population needs economic relief, sitting across from an American administration that needs a political win before the midterms and whose European allies need the oil to flow again before the airports run out of fuel. Both sides need something from this room. Both sides are pretending they don't. And between them, across a table in a Pakistani hotel, is the gap between what this war accomplished and what either side is willing to admit it cost. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because when that gap closes, and it will close, you'll want to already be watching.